Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar on the cloud, hosted by Convergence Consulting Group, or CCG, and featuring the Republican National Committee and Microsoft. My name is Caroline Wright. I'm the marketing manager for CCG, and today I'll be your moderator for the webinar. We are broadcasting for you live today from the RNC headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Thank you guys for having us. We have a packed schedule for you all today, so we likely won't have time for a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. However, please submit your questions throughout the webinar using the chat window to your right. If there is time, we will get to them at the end. If not, we will be sure to email you a response following the live webinar. All attendees will be muted and in listen-only mode throughout this webinar. Please use the same chat window on your right if you have any audio difficulties. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording and the presentation slides will be emailed to you following this webinar. Okay, today's agenda will include an introduction of your speakers, a dive into what the term cloud encompasses and the many benefits of cloud options for your business when it comes to cloud hosting services. We'll then hear from the RNC's Deputy Chief Data Officer and Director of Business Intelligence on their experience this past year migrating to Microsoft Azure Cloud. Again, here's a quick highlight of the agenda, the purpose. We're going to define the cloud and cloud computing, analyze some different cloud offerings and vendors for you guys, and walk through a recent success story. All right, a quick look at your speakers today. First, we have Nate Blessing. He's a Microsoft Solution Architect and Consultant with Convergence Consulting Group. His expertise is primarily in financial, insurance, and political industries, helping develop data warehousing and ETL development. We have Liam O'Rourke, who is the Deputy Chief Data Officer for the Republican National Committee. Liam has held multiple positions within the RNC's data division. He has a deep knowledge and appreciation of all the data products that the RNC has to offer, from campaigns, state parties, and sister committees. He has hands-on experience working with historical election results, geospatial data, voter registration lists, and predictive analytics, all of which can play a critical role in winning campaigns. Patrick Stewart is the Director of Business Intelligence for the Republican National Committee. He and his team primarily focus on managing the RNC's BI tools and creating intuitive reports. Before his move to the RNC, Patrick took a brief break from politics during the 2014 election cycle to run the international business development for a custom manufacturing firm. Prior to this role, he worked as a consultant alongside the RNC's data department during the 2012 presidential election, managing the RNC's custom-built data portal used by state parties and campaigns throughout the country. A little bit more about our company real quick. As a consulting organization, CCG is a data and analytics focused consultancy. We're headquartered out of Tampa, and we operate throughout the Southeast. We do not have a product of our own, but instead help customers to better leverage technology investments that they've already made through management consulting, strategic consulting, BI and analytics consulting, and data management consulting. We focus on quality delivery in every engagement. We encourage you to meet our people, connect with us through LinkedIn after this webinar, and discover the passion that we all share through data and analytics through our blog. If you want to learn more about our methodology for successful solution delivery, or if you're interested in joining a company like ours, there will be contact information at the end of this webinar. I'll now hand it over to Nate for the more exciting stuff, the Cloud 101.
Thank you, Caroline, for that introduction. So today we're going to talk a lot about the cloud, specifically Microsoft Azure. But before we dive into that, we'll kind of do a baseline, and we'll just talk a little bit about Cloud 101, what you should know going into learning about the cloud and its offerings. All right, we'll start with the three foundational, what I like to call pillars of the cloud, and they are abbreviated as IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. A lot of you might have heard of this already, but we'll break it down a little bit. We'll start with IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service. And what this is spinning up environments in the cloud with a cloud provider. This gives you a near total control over the environment. And some examples of this would be Azure virtual machines, an entire virtual network infrastructure, or setting up Active Directory and domains in the cloud. And at the bottom of each of these pillars, if you will, I've added some word associations to help you kind of conceptualize what it is that you're doing within each of these. And for infrastructure as a service, I want you to think about your environment or a setup. Moving into PaaS, Platform as a Service, these are going to be the tools that you use to build something greater. kind of your platforms to build out applications. And some example of these are Azure's SQL Data Warehouse, Azure SQL Database, Azure HD Insight, and Azure Machine Learning. And just to kind of relate platform as a service to infrastructure as a service, sure, platform as a service, you have Azure's HD Insight, which is a Hadoop cluster on the cloud. But at the same time, you could take infrastructure as a service kind of components, virtual machines, and build your cluster on your own. Why would you do that when you have Azure HD Insight? They make it easy for you, right? The word associations I want you to think about are the tools or building something with platform as a service. And finally, SaaS, software as a service. This is a further abstraction away where you're getting specific services or software in or provided by a cloud provider. An example of this would be Office 365, Salesforce, or the Azure portal, where you can manage your SaaS implementations with an SaaS product. So think about a specific product or using something right off the bat. So definitions aside, what is it really, right? So I'm going to give you my attempt at a definition, which is it's a hosted environment using other people's hardware. Website and hosting companies have been doing this for years, so what's really the difference? I like to think of it as a constantly evolving hosted suite of infrastructure, platforms, and software that are used to build new applications and environments. And one of the big shifts now is that a lot of these products are geared towards data consumption, reporting, and interconnectivity rather than just strictly spinning up virtual machines or provisioning resources in the cloud. Here, some of the benefits to moving into the cloud, which there are numerous, just to highlight a few here would be, the ability to scale rapidly. What we like to do when working in Azure for clients is starting with a minimal viable product and what will get us to the results quickest while costing the least. And once we do that, you can poke and prod at the environment to kind of build that infrastructure up or scale that service up if you need to. The second bullet point here, secure Azure cloud providers make it really easy to secure your environment through different network security groups, firewall settings. You don't need a dedicated team of IT network engineers to set your environment up in the cloud. Microsoft and other cloud providers make it really easy to get started with a secure environment in their clouds. Another benefit here is redundancy, the ability to not only back up your infrastructure or environments in a secure kind of backup environment, but you can do it in a geographically dispersed manner, meaning you can set up an infrastructure in a U.S. East region and also have that replicated to a U.S. West region where, not only does that provide you the ability to fail over in case of disaster, but it allows you to spread out your resources in case you do need to have a separate node for your West customers than your East customers. And finally, another benefit is to reduce the cost. When you're working in a cloud provider, you are paying monthly or some other kind of breakdown for your software, and so you can spin up your resource when you want it and spin it down when you don't, and you're only paying for uptime on certain pieces of your infrastructure. We'll move into some of the big cloud vendors, some of the big players in the cloud space next, and here's a Gartner Magic Quadrant from August 2016, and in the top right here you can see Amazon Web Services, AWS, and Microsoft kind of paving the way for this new wave of cloud way of thinking. Google is coming up behind, and they are doing a pretty good job, I think, of replicating what Microsoft and AWS are doing, but Gartner has them pegged way ahead of everybody else. And in the bottom left, you have what I like to think of as your traditional hosting services or the original cloud players like Rackspace or VMware, where you could go and you could get a machine spun up back in the 90s even, but they don't seem to be catering to the same kind of products that Amazon and AWS are now with data consumption and reporting. And my next slide also kind of talks a little bit about that. So specifically in Microsoft Azure, they have offerings in all three as-a-service pillars, PaaS, IaaS, and SaaS. What's interesting to note, though, is that they don't limit themselves to just Microsoft technologies. Now you can get Linux virtual machines spun up in Azure. You can even spin up an Oracle database, and they have support for JavaScript and some of the other extensions, and a lot of open source big data technologies like Hadoop, Spark, and R. And that's something that you don't typically see, or you didn't typically see from Microsoft, before moving into the cloud. They wanted you to strictly use Microsoft technologies, but by adding support for these other technologies in the cloud, it kind of shows you that they're willing to play ball with other big players. Azure also has geographic redundancy, regions all over the world for that ability, like I said earlier, to geolocate into different regions. And in certain aspects of their offerings, they offer 99.5% uptime SLA. Here's an example of Azure's platform as a service offering from a data consumption lifecycle. And what you have, if you start in the bottom right, you have your ETL or ELT, as they like to call it with Azure Data Factory, ETL processes into a PaaS environment. And if you follow that up, you can see, you move your data into an Azure SQL database or an Azure Data Lake. You can move that up into an HD Insight cluster to do some analysis and some structuring, or Azure SQL Data Warehouse. So what you get by this image is that Microsoft Azure has a lot of platforms that you can use to integrate data from various sources coming from everywhere into a final, up at the top here, a final reportable state for your various users. And I'll also highlight that in this image, actually, you can see a support for both what TDWI is considering Mode 1 versus Mode 2. Mode 1 is your traditional ETL lifecycle processes where you're building out rigid processes to bring in structured data that you're eventually going to report on for your CEOs and other executives. Mode 2, however, is your not so structured, almost big data-like data that you have coming in from various aspects of your business, and that's highlighted on the left here with sensors, data feed, and into Azure Data Lake. But that gives you the ability to kind of do your data munging and promote that data on a relatively short life cycle that you wouldn't need with a long, thought-out process like a traditional ETL development. So why does all this matter? Well, IT professionals, specifically infrastructure professionals, should be really excited with this offering because they can build environments from a seemingly endless pool of resources. And not only can you have Microsoft backing your data center, but you can do it quickly. You can do it using familiar interfaces, either through Azure's web portal or command line with PowerShell, for example. And it's in an environment where the product line continues to evolve. Microsoft is constantly pumping out products in the Azure portal. They have a lot of things that are constantly popping up as preview that get pushed through to a full production release, which is really exciting. It shows that they really care about the Azure product, and it's not something that they're ready to abandon at all. Developers also have access to all of the resources that they need, and they're able to provision more services as they need. So like I mentioned earlier, if they're starting with a minimal viable product, they're able to scale up resources or look at different products that may suit their need better than what they started out with. And finally, any outages, upgrades, these are all managed by your provider. You don't have to worry about upgrading RAM on that server in that closet because Microsoft's going to do it for you. So just things to think about with Azure. With all those benefits, there's obviously some cons to the other side of the argument, right? first, for the people like me who like to plug things in and like to turn all the knobs, there's no physical control over the environment. So if you are one of those people, you'll quickly realize that you don't have the kind of granular control to, make little performance changes to your hard drive configuration, because that's all kind of abstracted away from you. Something else to consider is the monthly cost of some of these products, and what I have up here on the screen is just some example prices of Azure virtual machine sizes. Now these are estimates, but it's just something to consider that you do pay for what you get, in that you're paying a lot, but you're also getting a lot. And some things that aren't considered in these prices are some SQL Server licensing, or your disk sizes if you're going to go traditional hard disk drive versus a solid state drive. Finally, you're charged by your usage. So in some cases, you're charged monthly or hourly for a particular product, but in some other cases, you're charged per event. So for example, I have up here, Event Hub is 2.8 cents per million event. And if you try to wrap your head around all that, it kind of seems like you get nickel and dimed here and there. But at the end of the month, you get this nice kind of spreadsheet-looking output of all of your usage, which can still be a little hard to follow and break down, but it does help you see exactly what you're paying for and how you can scale back resources if you need to. So with all that said, just something I want you to take away from this kind of conversation here, and that's how quickly can you today acquire and begin working on a machine with the following specifications. Keep this in mind. It needs to have 16 CPU cores, 224 gigabytes of RAM, 1 terabyte of storage, and running Windows Server 2012 R2 and SQL Server 2016 Enterprise on the machine. While you're thinking about that, I want you to also think about, have you considered the software licenses that you're going to need? Do you have the network infrastructure capacity to bring this new server online? How about a physical location to put this server, or a team or personnel to manage the new resource? Well, in my testing and just my experience with Azure, you can get a server of this size spun up within 15 minutes without having to consider any of the stuff here on the right-hand side. So those are my experiences with Azure, and I hope you find the use in the product like I have. So now I'm going to turn it over to Liam O'Rourke, who is the Deputy Chief Data Officer at the RNC, and he's going to talk about our Azure migration project that we did with them last year.
Great. Thanks, Nate. As Nate mentioned, my name is Liam O'Rourke. I'm the Deputy Chief Data Officer of the RNC. I'm joined by our Director of Business Intelligence, Patrick Stewart. We'd just like to take a few minutes to kind of walk through the project that we undertook with CCG this past year, and kind of lay out some of the challenges that we were facing and the solution that we ultimately decided upon and implemented. Just to give you guys a little bit of background on who we are, the Republican National Committee is kind of the governing body of the Republican Party of the United States. The committee itself is organized every 4 years at the Republican National Convention, handles things such as the Republican Party platform, but most importantly, in our view, is function as the primary campaign committee for the Republican Party. What that means is, specifically from our perspective in the RNC Data Department, we're responsible for providing a picture of the American electorate for any candidate running for office with an R next to their name. With a registered voter population approaching 200 million individuals, this becomes a pretty enormous project, and one that requires a well thought out solution in terms of managing a database of this scale. Now, as we approached the 2016 election cycle, we took a very close look at our situation internally, where we had our strengths, what were our weaknesses, and we discovered a number of things. First, the RNC has been a large compiler of political data for over 2 decades. So we've acquired a lot of information over that time. We were one of the first organizations, or the first organization, to build a national database of registered voters. So, data was not something new or foreign to this organization. However, we did realize that over those decades of acquiring data, we had developed many disparate silos of information that did not talk to each other well. We also realized that after the 2012 election, after taking a deep look at kind of the general operations of the RNC, there was a renewed commitment to data and analytics and what role those would play in coming campaigns. Now, in 2014, we did a good job of kind of innovating and introducing some new advances in predictive analytics that we knew we wanted to carry forward into the 2016 cycle. The challenge that we had was, how do we make this operational for a presidential campaign rather than a midterm election where less people were going to be engaged? We also, as a result of kind of these different silos that had emerged over the years, we had trouble executing on different reporting requirements that arose throughout the course of the campaign. The time it took to assemble the necessary data points, construct a report, and disseminate that to the consumer was growing. The turnaround times were growing untenable, and something had to be done to address that. Lastly, prior to this undertaking, all of our, or most of the RNC's infrastructure was hosted inside the building here in Washington, D.C., with a couple servers hosted through another partner, AirNet Group, down in Tennessee. Specifically for our in-house or on-premise infrastructure, the costs and frankly, the reliability of those that infrastructure was growing at a rate that was not favorable to us. So just before we move on, just to give you a sense of where we were at, we were using primarily SQL Server 2008 prior to this migration. We relied on SQL Server reporting services for most of our reporting needs, and also used SQL Server integration services to do much of our ETL work. So as we approached or entered into the 2016 election cycle, we entered with a number of goals that we wanted to achieve that we thought would help position us better for victory in November of 2016. As we looked at all the different data sources that we had, we recognized that we had the ability to put together a really rich profile of each voter. The problem was we had a difficult time pulling those different assets together and analyzing them as a whole rather than in their individual parts. So we wanted to find a way to integrate all those different sources and gain a more complete picture of the voter. The second thing that we wanted to accomplish was maximizing data consumption. There's been such a value placed on data and analytics, and it's kind of the buzziest part of campaigns these days. We fully support that. That's why we're here. But the demand for data was only increasing, and so we needed to make it easier for people to get their hands on the data that we had and act upon it. We needed a mechanism or several mechanisms to distribute this data on a national level. As we said earlier, we work hand in glove with any candidate running for office who has an R next to their name. So, working with presidential candidates all the way down to, city council candidates. We needed a mechanism to get the relevant data to each of these campaigns in a timely fashion. Again, as demands for data and reporting and analysis increased, so were the demands on how timely this information was getting out to folks. So we wanted to make sure that we implemented a solution that delivered everything in a timely fashion and also maximize our staff time in terms of their ability to turn around requests and accomplish more during their day with an infrastructure that was more reliable and speedy. Again, we wanted to reduce some of those maintenance costs that we were experiencing by hosting our infrastructure on premise. So lastly, and this is a big one for us, as we entered into to this project, we had to accomplish this migration and kind of re-architecture with minimal disruption to our ongoing daily tasks here at the RNC. Election day does not move, so we had a finite window to get this done, and we had to do it in a way that allowed us to continue to do our day jobs as this project was unfolding. Just to kind of touch again, I mentioned this already, but the way that our infrastructure was set up prior to this engagement was the majority of our servers were located here in RNC headquarters in Washington, D.C. We were running SQL Server 2008 on a number of different machines. We also had a couple of machines located in Tennessee where we housed some of our more robust analytic databases. So again, we're kind of spread out, and it became more and more difficult to manage over the years. So let's just talk quickly about the process that we went through as we were building out this project. One, we had to come to a determination as to what tool or platform we wanted to use to accomplish this. Based on a number of factors, including our familiarity here at the RNC with Microsoft product suite, we chose to go with the Microsoft Azure cloud. Specifically, as Nate alluded to, there are several different options there. We kind of pursued the IaaS path, where we chose to stand up a variety or a series of virtual machines that would be purposed for discrete tasks across the environment. We also managed our users and permissions through an Azure Active Directory framework. Once we had that tool selected, we worked closely and really just handed the ball off to CCG to get all of the data that we've acquired over the years into this cloud environment. Specifically for this project, we were migrating over 10 terabytes of data across a number of servers and somewhere close to 250 databases into the new Azure environment. Once we got that far, then we had to take a look and say, okay, now we've still got a ton of data spread across a bunch of different databases. How do we cleanse all this and consolidate it, and how do we make it actionable? Which leads us to the last phase of this project, which was building out what we call the unified presentation layer. And this is our attempt at achieving that 360-degree view of the voter that we talked about earlier. Getting all of the data points that we have available on an individual or a consumer of this information, and making those accessible to both our staff internally as well as external consumers of the data. So what did that lead to? As I mentioned, we managed to migrate over 250 databases to the cloud in a period of under 2 months. It was quite the undertaking, and we really could not have done it without the help of CCG here. Once that migration was completed, we took the time to audit everything that was in each of those databases and come up with a plan for what we wanted to include and exclude as we move to combine these disparate sources into the unified presentation layer. We came up, again, working very closely with CCG on a series of ETL packages using SSIS, and also, it's not mentioned here, but we here at the RNC started using Team Foundation Server pretty heavily in our development processes. This was a big step for us here, to have multiple people able to collaborate on various tasks and not overwrite people's work. It was a big step for us as we try to expose more and more members of our staff to tasks related to the ETL of data across our environment. So we were able to take all these different sources and combine them into this unified presentation layer through a process which is now entirely done in the cloud. It's highly reliable, and it is much faster than what we were experiencing with our on-premise architecture. We've also been able to incorporate not just publicly available data from voter registration lists to election results. We've also been able to accumulate proprietary consumer lists and census data that allow us to really enrich the profile of the voter that we're looking at. Lastly, and I'd like to turn it over to Patrick Stewart here, we were able to focus on new ways to expose this data to our consumers.
Thanks, Liam. So to reiterate what Liam was saying, with this new infrastructure, we were able to expedite our ETL processing and build this UPL, this unified presentation layer. And what that meant for myself and my team was that we had a clean process that provided us pristine data that we could then use to build semantic reports and visualizations and provide this analytics to our users out in the field. It made our data actionable, and it's what guided our campaign, quite frankly, in 2016. It allowed our users to use this data to make decisions on a day-to-day basis to execute their jobs. So what we did is once the UPL came online and we had this presentation layer, we actually went with Microsoft Power BI, which is a cloud-based analytics tool that lets us build dashboards and reports directly on top of our data. And using Microsoft Azure's infrastructure, being that our data was in the cloud, Power BI tied right into it with very little difficulty in the setup process. What that allowed us to do was build these reports on an expedited basis. So whereas previously we spent time developing SSRS reports and in some cases using other analytics tools, now we had very little time in spinning up a new data model and building customized reports off of that. Furthermore, it allowed us easily to scale for the election. We, as you can imagine, our staff expands quite significantly in an election cycle, and it contracts afterwards. And by being on the cloud, we were able to add and remove users on the fly through the Azure Active Directory, and that made it very cost-effective for us when it came to licensing fees that were, instead of us buying a year out, we were able to purchase those on a month-to-month basis as our user base grew or post-election shrunk. And in addition to that, we were able to manage our users effectively without having too much of a security concern, whether that be whitelisting IPs or anything. We had none of those concerns. We simply added a license, added a user to the Active Directory, and we were able to provide access both internally. In addition to this, into our Power BI implementation that allowed us to provide, quite frankly, visually stunning reports that our users found incredibly useful. We were also able to expose the raw data through a program that we had internally that allowed us to provide access directly to our SQL Server databases, again, with minimal security concerns. And it allowed our data staff that were actually out in the field to manipulate the data and use it for their own customized purposes within their states or their congressional districts or whatever region they were operating within.
Yeah, and thanks, Patrick. Just to touch briefly on some of the security issues that Patrick noted, as we moved to the Azure environment, we wanted to protect our assets that we had migrated. Obviously, a lot has been made of data security over the last several months, and particularly in electoral politics. And so we wanted to protect the work that we had done here. We did that by closing all unnecessary ports. Anybody that wanted to access any of the servers that we had stood up had to be cleared, their IP whitelisted to gain access. And then once that IP was cleared, we provisioned credentials using the Azure Active Directory within the environment to authenticate those people again. So we implemented a strategy that offered a series of checks as we were granting access to people. And for our staff here in the building, it was less cumbersome to gain access to the various pieces of information, whereas people accessing this information from outside of the RNC had to go through a more rigorous process. So now you can, this is just kind of before and after look at where we ended up. So again, we started with most of our infrastructure located on-premise here at the RNC, with a couple machines located in Tennessee. At the end of this project, we had migrated all of that information to the Azure environment, specifically the US East 2 region. We currently have 7 different servers stood up that are each tasked with a very specific role in the life cycle of our data. Again, we wanted to really provide a workflow, whereas people who were charged with ingesting, loading raw data, cleansing that data, and those tasked with producing reports and consuming the data were not conflicting with each other and causing unnecessary bottlenecks. So we did that by distributing these different tasks and workloads across a series of different machines. All right. So where did this endeavor get us? Well, we found ourselves with a solution that consolidated all these different data sources that we have available to us and allowed users to easily consume exactly what they needed without having to reach across different servers or databases. They knew where to go to get the information that they needed, whether that be, again, voter lists, the results of surveys that were being conducted out in the field, our predictive analytics program, voter scores, just basic counts, what have you. 2, this helped reduce the cost that we were seeing rise of our infrastructure that we had here at the RNC. A lot of this infrastructure was pretty dated, it was lacking in storage capacity, and so we really got a lot of benefit out of moving to the Azure environment where, storage is, frankly, pretty close to unlimited. We could add different storage disks as needed as we saw the scope of different areas increasing or decreasing. So a lot of flexibility at a much cheaper overall price point for us to make this move. Again, as Patrick noted, we were able to, having made this transition, we were able to take all these disparate data sources that we had cleansed and brought together in this data warehouse and expose it using Microsoft Power BI to really empower our users to gain actionable insights and intelligence from the data that we work so hard to collect and disseminate to our users. Finally, this really helped us to develop a kind of farm team of Republican data operatives. As I think Patrick mentioned, we were able to expose the underlying data warehouse to some of the staff that we were employing in various states across the country this past cycle, where a person who was responsible for managing the data program in, say, Ohio could access the exact same information that we had here at the RNC, limited in scope to their area of responsibility, and they could, we could work with them to tune SQL queries that they could execute to meet any, kind of specific reporting requirements that they might have. We could work with them to understand kind of the underlying data and why we made the decisions we made to store it in the way that we did. Really just kind of cultivating the next generation of data-savvy Republican operatives. So this went a long way in helping us accomplish that. And finally, the one result that is not listed on here, this ended up paying off in a big way. We were a big partner with the Trump campaign. We worked very closely with them to execute on a data-driven strategy that on election day resulted in the election of President Trump and the continued Republican majorities in both the House and Senate. Obviously, a lot went into those victories, but our ability to provide timely and accurate analysis based on data and not just intuition was a key component of those victories and would not have been possible without this migration. So with that, I will turn it back over to Caroline, who will wrap us up.
Thank you, Liam and Patrick and Nate. And thank you guys all for joining us today. A recap, hopefully you guys all are walking away with a better understanding of what really cloud and cloud computing mean. Some of the pros and cons to cloud usage, we're very open about the fact that this can be very beneficial, and really all organizations are embracing cloud, but there's a lot of considerations when stepping into it. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this presentation from the RNC and hearing about their journey to Microsoft this year. If you want to learn more about Microsoft Azure, you can through the Azure Learning Path, which I'll provide a link in the follow-up email. And if you want to talk to a specialist about your cloud considerations and your migration path, please feel free to reach out to us. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email them in as well, and we'll be answering those on an individual basis. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the webinar.